So imagine learning that the United Kingdom, like the nation that literally birthed the Magna Carta, right?
Right, the absolute foundational document of Western individual liberty.
Exactly. Imagine learning that they recently arrested more of their own citizens for digital speech than Vladimir Putin's Russia.
I mean, it sounds like a dystopian fiction premise, doesn't it?
It really does.
You got this country that basically invented the modern framework for legal rights, and they're just enthusiastically building a digital surveillance state. And it's actually outpiecing a recognized autocracy.
But the thing is, it isn't fiction. It's a very real, completely measurable phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it forces you to ask this deeply uncomfortable question, like, how does a society with such a robust tradition of liberty just, willingly build the architecture of its own subjugation?
It's a massive question.
It really is. So welcome to you, the listener, to another deep dive. We are so glad you're here. Today, we are attempting to map out an intellectual landscape that completely scrambles the traditional political compass.
Totally scrambled.
Yeah. We're exploring a highly unusual, incredibly dense dialogue between two men who, well, based on the old political maps, they should be absolute enemies.
Right. On paper, they shouldn't even be talking. We're looking at an extensive conversation between Bret Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist and a self-described liberal, and Tucker Carlson.
Who is, of course, a very prominent conservative political commentator.
Exactly. And our mission today is to just really unpack their sprawling discussion because they cover so much ground.
Oh, yeah. They tackle the mechanics of tribalism, the biological complexities of geopolitics.
And the fading of Western democratic values.
Right. And also the underlying psychology of power. We are going to examine how these two thinkers, starting from entirely different vantage points, somehow arrive at some remarkably convergent and frankly sobering conclusions about the current state of the global system.
But before we begin mapping this out, we really need to establish a crystal clear boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, this is super important.
The arguments we are analyzing today wade into intensely charged, highly controversial geopolitical waters. I mean, this discussion touches on the Middle East, the war in Gaza, the actions of the modern state of Israel, prominent U.S. political figures, and international warfare.
It's a lot of heavy stuff.
It is. So we, as your guides on this deep dive, are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of the left-wing or right-wing viewpoints presented by these individuals.
Exactly. We are absolutely not here to tell you what to think. Our mission is purely analytical.
Right.
We are just laying out the complex theories and frameworks presented by Weinstein and Carlson. That way, you can weigh the evidence yourself, observe the mechanics of their arguments, and, evaluate their perspectives independently.
We are basically dissecting the lens through which they view global events.
And the way this specific lens was forged is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, their origin story is wild.
It really is, because how does a dialogue that begins with this visceral story about a mob on a progressive college campus eventually lead to a thesis about the collapse of international diplomacy?
And the rise of what they call a godless Moses, right?
Exactly. It's such a massive leap. So to understand how they arrive at those macro-level geopolitical theories, you kind of have to look at the micro-level origins of their relationship.
Because it completely defies the standard narrative of how political media operates.
It does. So the relationship begins back in 2017. Weinstein was a professor at Evergreen State College.
Which is a very progressive institution in Washington state.
Right. And he found himself targeted by a massive student protest. It was essentially a mob that had just completely taken over the campus.
Yeah, it was a huge national news story at the time.
It was everywhere. And Weinstein, who views himself as a traditional liberal, suddenly receives an invitation to appear on Carlson's national television show.
And he completely assumes it's a trap.
Oh, 100%. He describes it as expecting this Faustian bargain. Because in the media ecosystem, the standard operating procedure would be for a conservative host to bring on an embattled liberal professor merely as a prop.
Right. The expectation was that he would just be paraded around. The host would basically say, look at the radical left eating their own. You got what you deserved.
Exactly. And Weinstein describes this incredibly tense arrival at the studio.
He was stressed.
Oh, incredibly. He's stuck in traffic. He gets to this remote broadcast studio super late. He is physically sweating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They drop him in a chair, thread a microphone up his shirt, and he hasn't even had time to brush his hair.
So he's just totally off balance.
Completely. He is fully bracing for a hostile, humiliating interrogation on live television.
Yet the interaction fundamentally alters his whole understanding of the political divide. because instead of exploitation, he finds genuine compassion from Carlson.
Yeah, Carlson is visibly incensed on Weinstein's behalf, and they end up bonding over this foundational shared principle.
Which is the absolute primacy of the individual.
Right. Carlson frames this belief that individuals should never be reduced to their lineage, their race, or their team as the absolute bedrock of Western civilization.
He actually states his default position is always to side with the man against the mob, period.
Which is a powerful way to put it. And that shared understanding that you judge a person strictly by their choices and not their bloodline becomes the anchor of their entire dialogue.
But what's so compelling is how they take this personal anecdote of surviving a mob and use it to analyze broader tools of modern social destruction.
Yeah, they introduced this concept that Weinstein calls gaslighting by ricochet.
Let's break that down, because gaslighting by ricochet is this incredibly sophisticated mechanic of character assassination.
It really is.
Consider how public debate traditionally functions, right?
Yeah.
You have an intellectual opponent, and you argue against their ideas.
That's the normal way, yeah.
But this tactic bypasses the ideas entirely. Instead, you preemptively label the opponent with the most toxic societal slurs available. You call them a bigot, a fascist, an extremist.
But the crucial point they make here is that the primary target of the smear isn't actually the person being smeared.
Wait, it's not.
No, it's a trap set for the audience.
Oh, right. The goal is to manipulate the curiosity of the listener.
Exactly. Weinstein explains that if you, the public, have been told repeatedly that a certain commentator is just this raging zealot, you build a mental image of a monster.
Sure, you expect them to sound crazy.
Right. And if you eventually tune in to listen to them for yourself, and instead you hear a measured, moderate, well-intentioned analysis, it creates massive cognitive dissonance.
Because your brain is trying to reconcile the monster you were promised with the reasonable person you're actually hearing.
Exactly. You don't immediately assume the media lied to you. Instead, you doubt your own sanity. You wonder, am I missing the obvious bigotry that everyone else sees? Am I a sucker?
Wow. So to avoid feeling like you've been duped, to avoid that ricochet hitting you, you just stop listening altogether.
Yep. You avoid engaging with the person. The booby trap successfully quarantines the individual without ever having to actually defeat their arguments.
It just completely destroys good faith engagement.
It does, and that isolation leads directly to a much darker psychological phenomenon that Carlson explores, which is the danger of becoming the slur.
Let's unpack the psychology of that, because it is profound.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Carlson suggests that if a society repeatedly labels you with a horrific term, if they relentlessly call you a racist or an anti-Semite, your initial reaction is naturally outrage and denial.
Of course, you fight back.
Right. But what happens after the social cost has already been fully extracted from you?
What do you mean by extracted?
Well, if you've already lost your career, your friends, your standing in the community, do you eventually experience a collapse of your psychological defenses?
Oh, I see. Carlson views this from a deeply religious perspective, right? He calls it soul imperiling.
Yes, exactly. The thesis is that if society treats you like a monster, regardless of your actions, the incentive to maintain your moral framework just evaporates.
You might think, well, if I am already serving the sentence, why am I fighting the conviction?
Precisely. A system of false accusations doesn't merely silence opposition. It acts as a manufacturing plant for the very extremism it claims to be fighting.
It pushes individuals into corners where tribal hatred feels like the only logical refuge they have left.
It reminds me of how an autoimmune disease functions in human biology.
Oh, that's a great analogy, especially given Weinstein's background as an evolutionary biologist. How does that map out?
Well, in an autoimmune disorder, the body's immune system loses the ability to distinguish between foreign dangerous invaders and its own healthy tissue, so it begins attacking itself.
Right.
This gaslighting by ricochet, this constant slurring of individuals who actually share the foundational values of the society, it operates exactly like an autoimmune response.
The social body attacks its own healthy cells.
Exactly. And ultimately, it weakens the entire organism, making it highly vulnerable to systemic collapse.
And that biological framing maps so seamlessly onto the geopolitical arguments they make later.
It really does. Because this micro-level tribalism judging individuals strictly by the team they belong to, it scales up dramatically.
Yeah, when that exact same logic is applied to the global stage, it leads to a core conflict in modern political discourse, which is the conflation of nation-states with entire populations.
This brings us to a highly charged segment of their discussion. Carlson defends himself against recent public accusations of anti-Semitism, and he does so by drawing a very rigid, specific line.
Right. Both men argue quite forcefully that criticizing the actions, the policies, or the geopolitical maneuvers of the modern nation-state of Israel is entirely distinct from harboring bigotry toward Jewish people globally.
They view this as a dangerous conflation conundrum. Carlson argues that the moment you equate a modern government with a global religious or ethnic identity, you create an impossible trap.
Because if a state and a religion are treated as identical entities, then any criticism of the government's military strategy or foreign policy is automatically classified as racial or religious hatred.
Exactly. And if you demand that the United States must have zero divergent interests from another sovereign nation, that they must operate as if they're the exact same country with the exact same goals, you put society on a collision course.
You completely eliminate the space for diplomatic debate.
And this erosion of debate leads Carlson to mourn the loss of what he terms Anglo-Saxon restraint.
Let's explore the historical context of that phrase, because he talks about growing up in a wasp-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture in Southern California.
Right. And he points out that a core, non-negotiable feature of that culture was a rigid social rule. You do not parse someone else's religious views in the public square or at a dinner party.
He is highlighting a historical Western norm here, one that was arguably born out of the horrific religious wars in Europe centuries ago.
Right. The consensus was to keep highly specific, divisive religious doctrines entirely out of public policy debates.
And the reasoning wasn't merely about being polite, right?
No, not at all. It was a hardcore survival mechanism designed to maintain neighborhood peace.
He argues that if you expose anyone's deeply held religious doctrines to the harsh light of a secular public square, those doctrines will inherently sound irrational to outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, if you sit down with your secular neighbors and start aggressively debating the literal transubstantiation of the Eucharist or specific eschatological end times prophecies, you are going to cause fractures that can never heal.
The restraint was essentially a technology for coexistence.
Bringing tribal religious doctrine into foreign policy decisions guarantees permanent, unresolvable war.
And Weinstein completely agrees with this. He views the current erosion of this secular boundary as a profound threat to Western stability.
But the conversation then pivots to a deeply controversial theory regarding why this boundary is being eroded in the first place.
Yeah, this part is fascinating. If conflating state actions with global populations is so dangerous, why does it seem like certain political actors are intentionally stoking these tribal tensions?
To try and understand this mechanism, the examine quote attributed to political commentator Bill Kristol.
According to Carlson, he was in a meeting decades ago where Kristol allegedly said, "A little anti-Semitism is good for the Jews. It reminds them of who they are."
Which is just, I mean, Carlson aggressively condemns the morality of that statement. He calls it poison.
Right. However, Weinstein approaches it from the cold, mechanical perspective of evolutionary strategy.
Because he's a biologist.
Exactly. He acknowledges that purely as a biological mechanism, a shared external threat is incredibly effective at keeping a population genetically and culturally intact.
Carlson actually uses the Armenian population in California as an observable example of this.
How does he frame that?
He notes that growing up, the Armenian community was highly distinct, deeply cohesive, and tended to marry within their group. And the underlying driver for that cohesion, he argues, was the shared inherited trauma of the genocide committed by the Ottoman Turks.
So the historical suffering and the societal insistence on passing the memory of that suffering to the next generation acts as a powerful evolutionary glue.
Yes. And the speculative question they arrive at is really chilling.
Lay it out.
Are certain leaders intentionally dialing up external hatred? Because scaring their own population forces the group to circle the wagons. Does manufacturing a five-alarm fire basically increase internal political power and cohesion?
But, I really have to push back on the logic of that demagoguery. Setting your own house on fire just so you can be the one to hand out the fire extinguishers seems like a catastrophically flawed strategy.
It does seem incredibly risky.
Right. You might gain absolute unquestioning loyalty from your family in the short term, but you are ultimately destroying the collaborative foundation of the entire neighborhood.
That's a great point.
If you intentionally court hostility, aren't you dooming the modern West to a tribal death spiral?
Well, Weinstein actually identifies that exact tension. He argues that historically, tribal displacement was a growth strategy.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning a population could take advantage of another population's inability to defend itself, exterminate them, and take their resources. It's brutal, but it was historical reality.
Right.
But he points out that in the nuclear era, playing the game of tribal displacement is a guaranteed path to human extinction. The game simply has to end.
So if the nuclear era demands an end to tribal mechanics, how do these actors continue to operate on the global stage?
Well, to understand the failure of modern foreign policy, Weinstein insists we have to stop viewing geopolitics as a neat, logical chess game.
And start viewing it as a wildly unpredictable living ecosystem, right?
Exactly. He approaches international relations through the lens of complex systems biology. Specifically, he uses the analogy of a tropical forest.
I love this analogy. He argues that the first rule when you enter a tropical forest is to assume you have absolutely no idea how it actually works.
Because it's too complex.
Right. He points out this fascinating biological paradox. Tropical forests actually violate the first principle of ecology, which is known as the competitive exclusion principle.
Remind me how that principle works.
It states that two species cannot inhabit the exact same ecological niche indefinitely. One will eventually outcompete the other.
Oh, sure. Survival of the fittest.
Yeah, but in a tropical forest, you might have hundreds of species of trees doing almost the identical thing, and science still does not fully understand the mechanism that allows them to coexist.
That's incredible. And this biological reality introduces the concept of epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility, yes. Carlson quotes his father here, noting that the beginning of wisdom is acknowledging the profound limits of your own understanding.
Right. If you don't start by admitting that your field of vision is restricted and your comprehension of a complex system is fundamentally flawed, you are guaranteed to cause catastrophic harm when you intervene.
And they apply this catastrophic lack of epistemic humility directly to U.S. foreign policy, specifically examining the posture toward Iran.
The claim made in their discussion is that the United States was pushed to the absolute brink of a highly risky conflict with Iran, largely driven by external pressure and neoconservative influence within the U.S. government.
And they map out the massive systemic risks of such a conflict. It wouldn't just be a localized military engagement.
No, it directly threatens the global economy.
Because Iran effectively controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is a massive choke point for the world's energy supply. A disruption there could trigger cascading economic failures worldwide.
And they highlight a massive paradox regarding the sitting U.S. president at the time, Donald Trump.
Yeah, the argument is that engaging in this conflict was absolutely not in Trump's political interest. Weinstein views it as an existential threat to Trump's presidency.
The logic is pretty straightforward, honestly. A military quagmire, spiking energy prices, and a traumatized public would almost guarantee massive losses in the midterm elections.
Which could potentially lead to a loss of the House and Senate, followed by impeachment.
So the question is, why would a president whose entire platform was built on avoiding new foreign entanglements engage in an action highly likely to burn down his own administration?
And this question leads them to a concept that, frankly, fundamentally rewired my understanding of government bureaucracy.
Wait, are you talking about Stafford Beer's cybernetic principle?
Yes, exactly. In cybernetics, which is the study of systems, control, and communication, there is a core heuristic known as Palsywid.
Palsywid, which stands for, the purpose of a system is what it does.
Let's break that down, because it's incredibly counterintuitive.
Usually we judge a system by its stated intentions, right? A school's purpose is to educate. A hospital's purpose is to heal.
Sure.
But Palsywid dictates that you must ignore the rhetoric entirely and observe the actual outputs. If a school consistently produces students who can't read, education is not its purpose. If a thermostat is set to 70 degrees, but the room is consistently 90 degrees, the thermostat isn't broken trying to reach 70. The system is currently functioning to maintain 90 degrees.
Wow. So applying Palsywid to the U.S. government, Weinstein posits a stunning theory.
Yeah, it's a huge claim.
If the permanent state, meaning the unelected bureaucracy, the intelligence agencies, the sprawling apparatus of Washington continuously produces outcomes that undermine the elected executive, you cannot call those outcomes mistakes.
Exactly. The theory presented is that the permanent state utilized every tool at its disposal, legal challenges, media leaks to prevent Trump's election, and they failed.
Right.
Therefore, pushing the executive toward a highly destructive foreign war with Iran wasn't a policy miscalculation. Under Palsywid, it was a feature, not a bug. It was a mechanism designed to hobble a leader the system could not control.
Hold on, let me just make sure I'm following the gravity of this logic.
Yeah.
They are genuinely suggesting that the intelligence and defense communities would risk a global economic meltdown and potentially thousands of lives in a Middle Eastern war, specifically to influence domestic midterm elections and ruin a single presidency.
That is the dark speculation they entertain. It's what we might call a parasite theory of power.
A parasite theory.
Yeah. The host organism, which is the Democratic Republic, is being hijacked by a parasitic permanent state. And this parasite steers the host into danger simply to neutralize internal threats to its own survival.
It really mirrors the danger of medical intervention.
How so?
Well, Weinstein points out that modern medicine constantly makes the error of treating a layered, complex biological system as if it were just a complicated machine with predictable levers.
Oh, right. Like the body is just a car engine.
Exactly. For instance, science still doesn't fully grasp the fundamental biological why of human sleep. We just don't know why we need it on a cellular level.
Which is crazy to think about.
It is. But if you don't fully understand the baseline state of the system, how can you confidently predict the cascading side effects of introducing an experimental drug?
You can't. The intervention will always produce unintended, often disastrous consequences.
Right. So similarly, how can politicians look at a massive, complex nation like Iran with deep historical traumas, complex internal power divisions, and massive civil unrest, and predict the fallout of assassinating a top military or religious leader?
They can't. The idea that you could eliminate the head of a major faction and expect the country to just neatly adopt Western democratic norms is described in their dialogue as a profound delusion born of arrogance.
Because the architects of these interventions lack the epistemic humility required to navigate the tropical forest of global affairs, they refuse to recognize the limits of their own knowledge.
And this leads directly to a deep psychological profile of one of the central figures navigating this forest.
Yes, they spend considerable time analyzing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
They are really attempting to understand the mindset of a leader who exemplifies this high-stakes, system-altering approach to geopolitics.
And the profile they construct is intense and highly critical.
Very critical. Though they do not paint Netanyahu as a fundamentally religious zealot, Carlson actually notes his largely secular Western upbringing and the fact that he spent significant formative years in the United States.
They also acknowledge him as a brilliant tactician, a man of undeniable historic force who has consistently bent political reality to his will.
But Carlson describes a hollow core beneath the tactical brilliance.
He points to a chaotic personal life, specifically highlighting a famously volatile domestic situation.
And you might ask, why does personal chaos matter in a leader of a nuclear-armed nation?
Exactly. Carlson argues that if you are making decisions upon which the fate of entire populations hang, you require a stable psychological foundation.
Right. A leader who exists in a state of domestic turmoil, who exudes what Carlson calls a sweaty desperation to maintain power, is fundamentally weak.
And weak men, cornered by their own political survival, are the most dangerous actors on the global stage.
They also identify a massive psychological driver influencing his foreign policy, which is a deep, palpable resentment toward the United States.
Let's explore the mechanics of that resentment, because it's a really interesting dynamic.
Well, Carlson describes the agonizing dynamic of a subordinate partner who feels historically and intellectually superior.
Netanyahu views himself as a grand shaper of historical events.
Yet, structurally, he is forced to constantly court American donors, lobby members of the U.S. Congress, and seek permission or weapons from the U.S. president.
The argument is that this dependency breeds intense resentment, and that results in a foreign policy posture that seeks to manipulate and entangle the United States rather than partner with it in good faith.
But the most profound shift they analyze is in the rhetoric used to justify the war in Gaza.
They focus specifically on Netanyahu's repeated public invocation of Amalek.
This requires us to understand the deep historical and biblical context of that term. The Amalekites were an ancient, historic enemy of the Israelites.
Right.
In the book of Samuel in the Old Testament, the decree regarding Amalek is not about standard warfare. God commands the absolute, total eradication of the Amalekites.
The text explicitly demands the slaughter of men, women, children, infants, and even their livestock. Nothing is to be spared.
So, by a modern head of state repeatedly using the term Amalek to describe a contemporary geopolitical opponent, He is signaling a complete abandonment of the secular Western framework of warfare.
Yeah, because the Western tradition, which was influenced by thinkers like Clausewitz, views war as politics by other means. It has limited objectives, rules of engagement, proportionality, and the ultimate goal is always a negotiated settlement.
Invoking Amalek replaces that framework with an Old Testament holy war. It authorizes total destruction.
We really must consider the system-breaking consequences of this rhetorical shift. If you are prosecuting a holy war against Amalek, the very concept of diplomacy becomes a sin.
Because you cannot sit down at a negotiating table with an entity that God has commanded you to completely eradicate.
Exactly. That perfectly explains their deep concern over specific military and tactical choices. They point out incidents where military strikes were carried out on the Jewish holiday of Purim.
Which is a holiday specifically celebrating the prevention of a genocide.
Right. Or instances where negotiation delegations were deliberately targeted.
Under standard military analysis, targeting negotiators might seem like a huge tactical error.
Huh.
But if we apply Posywid, the purpose of a system is what it does. These strikes are not errors.
They are diabolically effective strategic moves designed to permanently destroy the very concept of peace talks.
Think about the outcome. If you convince your opponent that agreeing to a negotiation table is actually just stepping into an assassination trap, they will never agree to talk to you again.
You haven't just won a battle. You have intentionally taken the option of peace off the table forever.
You are purposely tying the hands of future generations, basically dooming them to endless, unresolvable tribal conflict because you destroyed the architecture of diplomacy.
Which brings us to a fascinating paradox. How is an Old Testament, total annihilation holy war being prosecuted by a leader they just described as fundamentally secular?
They call it the godless Moses complex.
Through godless Moses complex.
Yeah. Is the invocation of Amalek driven by genuine newfound religious fervor? Or is it the ultimate cynical tool for political survival?
The discussion suggests that while Netanyahu may not be personally pious, his political survival is entirely reliant on minority coalition partners within Israel who do believe in executing a religious war.
Beyond political calculation, though, the psychological profile suggests he views himself as a manifest destiny figure. He embodies a Moses archetype, but stripped of the divine moral constraint.
He is a godless Moses, weaponizing ancient religious rhetoric to serve a modern expansionist and legacy-building agenda.
And the blurring of secular state power with total war religious rhetoric actively dismantles the collaborative, lineage-blind structures that Western stability actually relies on.
But if the ability to negotiate is being dismantled by individual executives over there, it forces us to look at how much power individual leaders are accumulating over here.
The conversation naturally zooms out from the Middle East to observe a terrifying macro-level trend regarding the fading of Western democratic structures.
Carlson makes a really stark observation about global governance. Legislative bodies across the world are becoming entirely superfluous.
He compares modern parliaments and congresses to the Roman Senate during the decline of the empire.
They still meet, they still wear the robes, they still give speeches, but they are purely ceremonial.
Exactly. The actual power, the ability to direct the military, control the currency, and dictate the lives of citizens is rapidly and undeniably consolidating into the executive branch.
Which brings us back to that staggering statistic we opened with. The United Kingdom arresting more people for digital speech than Russia.
How does that happen? How does a Magna Carta society build a surveillance state?
Well, Carlson argues that Western powers are slowly, almost unconsciously, aping the system of the world's most successful rising power, which is China.
Throughout history, the dominant global power sets the template, right?
Yep. When Rome rose, neighboring states copied Roman military and administrative structures. When the British Empire dominated, nations copied their naval and parliamentary models.
Today, in terms of raw economic efficiency, social control, and technological integration, the Chinese authoritarian model is proving incredibly successful for its ruling class.
The argument is that Western political elites look at the messy, inefficient, loud process of liberal democracy, and then they look at the streamlined, digitally enforced compliance of the Chinese system.
And they naturally begin to steer their own governments toward that level of executive control.
They want the efficiency of autocracy without abandoning the branding of democracy.
Which leads to Weinstein's deeply cynical yet fascinating biological theory regarding the U.S. Constitution.
He views the Constitution not merely as a legal document, but as an industrial-strength shield.
It was a system specifically engineered with dynamic tension checks and balances designed to fend off tyrants.
It was meant to be a permanent roadblock to anyone seeking asymmetric power over the population.
But biological systems evolve, and so does tyranny.
Weinstein argues that tyranny functions like a highly adaptable pathogen. It constantly probes the constitutional shield for weaknesses.
Over centuries, this pathogen has discovered that it cannot break the shield from the outside using brute force. A military coup in the United States would just be rejected by the host organism.
Therefore, the pathogen must trick the host into lowering the shield from the inside.
And how do you trick a free population into demanding their own subjugation?
You use fear and convenience. The pathogen utilizes massive external threats, the war on terror following 9/11, the global COVID-19 pandemic, to create a state of panic.
The public becomes so frightened that they willingly hand over their constitutional rights, accepting massive surveillance apparatuses like the Patriot Act in exchange for the promise of safety.
Furthermore, the pathogen uses technology AI-driven censorship, the potential for central bank digital currencies, to enforce compliance seamlessly.
The executive branch becomes technologically vastly more capable, better funded, and less accountable than the framers of the Constitution could have ever imagined.
The president can execute military strikes or regime change operations without congressional approval, effectively bypassing the legislative branch entirely.
This incredible centralization of power presents an almost insurmountable problem for the future. It's a problem that perfectly highlights the spread between what the citizens need and what the system allows.
We can call it the George Washington dilemma.
Explain the mechanics of that dilemma.
Well, the only known cure for a system that has hoarded too much power in the executive is a leader who attains that ultimate power and then willingly limits it.
Someone with the profound moral strength to say, I have the power to be a king, the military backs me, but I refuse to use it. I give the power back to the people.
That is what George Washington did, and it is honestly the only reason the American experiment survived its infancy.
But the paradox they identify is that the modern political ecosystem, the permanent state we discussed earlier, has evolved to recognize that specific kind of moral restraint as an existential threat to its own survival.
Exactly. The system, which is funded by massive special interests like defense contractors, pharmaceutical lobbies, and corporate conglomerates, demands a president it can control.
It requires an executive willing to wield that centralized power to protect the interests of the machine.
A modern-day George Washington wouldn't play ball. He would dismantle the machine.
Therefore, the system is perfectly calibrated to hunt down, smear, bankrupt, or politically eliminate anyone demonstrating that kind of moral restraint long before they ever get near the Oval Office.
We desperately need a Washington, but the mathematical reality of our media and political primary system guarantees we can never produce one.
It is a bleak, clinical assessment of our reality. The leak in the system, the mechanism that allows special interests to purchase policy that goes directly against the public interest, is just totalizing.
It really is.
Yeah.
We have covered an extraordinary amount of intellectual terrain today.
I really have.
We started by examining the micromechanics of character assassination, exploring how gaslighting by ricochet and the psychological threat of becoming the slur-enforced tribal compliance.
We analyzed the profound danger of conflating the actions of a modern nation-state with an entire global religion, and explore the evolutionary strategy of using inherited trauma and fear as a biological glue for political power.
We waded into the complex biology of geopolitics, realizing that a lack of epistemic humility in the tropical forest of international relations, driven by a permanent state exhibiting parasitic behavior, leads to catastrophic, system-breaking blunders.
We scrutinize the shift in the rhetoric of modern warfare, where secular leaders invoke ancient texts demanding total destruction, effectively burning the architecture of diplomacy to the ground to ensure permanent conflict.
And finally, we looked at the terrifying centralization of global executive power, the unconscious aping of authoritarian models, and a constitutional system infected by a pathogen that tricks the public into demanding their own subjugation, systematically eliminating any leader capable of moral restraint.
As we stated at the beginning, our objective was not to tell you that Weinstein and Carlson possess the absolute truth.
No, not at all.
Our mission was to illuminate how these two prominent voices are analyzing the world. They have provided a cohesive, if dark, model for understanding the current collapse of Western norms.
It is entirely up to you, the listener, to look at the evidence, observe the outputs of the global system around you, and decide if their framework accurately explains the reality you experience.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
Oh, lay it on us.
We talked heavily about Possewood, the cybernetic principle, that the purpose of a system is what it does.
Right.
Look around at the global system right now. Look at the measurable outputs. It consistently produces outcomes that destroy diplomacy. It actively rewards the most vicious, unyielding tribalism.
It rapidly centralizes absolute power into unaccountable executive branches, and it systematically punishes anyone who attempts to return power to the individual.
So if the purpose of a system is what it does, is it possible that our society isn't actually broken at all?
What if it is working exactly as it was designed to?
Think about the United Kingdom arresting citizens for Facebook posts. You might assume the system of liberty is broken.
But what if the system of control is simply coming online? What if the machine is doing exactly what it was built to do?
Keep your eyes open and always question the outputs.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.